There is a long-held belief that the presence of certain characteristics in individuals makes them more likely to engage in offending behaviour than those who do not have those characteristics. An identification of those characteristics would give us a sense of security in our day-to-day living. That is, if we could just look at a group of people, for example, and know immediately which one of them were serial killers rather than psychologists or musicians, it'd be immensely useful and it would make solving crime a whole lot easier. And this idea that offenders are in some way physically different to non-offenders dates back to the 1800s, with perhaps the most famous example being the work of Cesare Lombroso, who was an Italian anthropologist. So he sought a relationship between appearance and character in his work The Criminal Man that was published in 1887. In Lombroso's view, criminals were a throwback to more primitive times, and this explained their physical difference to non-criminals. So he proposed that typically criminals had smaller brains, heavy jaws, asymmetrical skulls, projecting ears, and crooked or flat noses. And they were also colourblind, left-handed, and physically quite weak. Lombroso even went as far as to suggest that different types of criminals had different physiologies. So murderers had cold, glassy, bloodshot eyes, abundant curly hair, strong jaws, long ears, and thin lips. So how or why did he come up with such a characterisation, which by his own admission accounted for only about 1/3 of all criminals? Well, his population for study were the prisons, which at the time were a place of shelter for those at the edges of society, so the destitute, the infirm, the homeless, the physically diseased, and the mentally disordered. Now, Lombroso's views were not shared by everyone, including some of his own students, and so by 1899, when he published another book called Crimes, Its Causes and Remedies, he'd actually revised his views to reflect the need to take into account the influence of social and economic factors in understanding criminal behaviour. However, Lombroso's early views have been partially mirrored in later work, including that of Sheldon and Glueck. So Sheldon picked up the idea of a link between physique and behaviour. He proposed a somatic typology comprised of 3 dimensions of physique and corresponding temperaments. The mesomorphs were muscular, athletic, strong body type with an assertive, vigorous and bold personality. The endomorphs were obese, soft and round, and were fun-loving, sociable and jolly. And the ectomorphs were tall and thin with well-developed brains and were introverted. So Sheldon compared 200 delinquents with 200 non-delinquents, and he concluded that the mesomorphs were best suited to criminality. Their aggressiveness paired with a lack of inhibitory control made them prime candidates. And this conclusion was backed up by Glueck in a later study. Adding in a 4th type of balance to Sheldon's typology, they compared 500 delinquents matched with 500 non-delinquents on a range of demographic variables. And they concluded that significantly more delinquent youth were mesomorphs than non-delinquents. But the relationship was not perfect. A substantial proportion of delinquents were not mesomorphs, and this led them to conclude that the physique alone did not adequately explain delinquent behaviour. So while it may now seem ridiculous to think that we could differentiate offenders from those who don't offend on the basis of the way they look, the idea of having an easy way of differentiating these two groups was very seductive, particularly for those of us in the non-offending group. So it's perhaps not surprising that the search for an easy way to clearly differentiate the offenders from the non-offenders did not end there.